this particular session, we're focused on assumptions in thinking. Now we can talk about assumptions from multiple perspectives. So let me just lay out a brief definition and then we'll start from there. A brief definition of assumption, which I'm pulling from the glossary of critical thinking terms and concepts. So assumption, a statement accepted or supposed as true without proof or demonstration. So anything that you're supposing to be true. And unstated premise or belief. So now unstated needs to be opened up. So by that, do we mean unconscious to the mind or unstated in the situation? Or third, a belief taken for granted. So a short way into this is whatever we're taking for granted as true. So we're not, when we are assuming something, we're not questioning it. It's not up for critique in the mind. If I'm assuming it, I'm taking it for granted. I'm assuming it to be true from the outset. So Gerald, would you like to?
Yeah, one small comment I can say is that in the second of those definitions, it says an unstated premise or belief, and the unstated is not necessary. It's not in the other two definitions. And oftentimes people in their writing will say, a major assumption I'm making in this writing is X, Y, and Z. So they'll state it right out in front. But, but often our assumptions are unstated. But it's not an essential part of the definition at all.
True. And that's why I think this could be expanded. But one thing that is important, I think, about assumptions is that they, when operating as assumptions, are operating at the unconscious level. In other words, we're assuming them to be true. We're operating our thinking based on these truths. And now, when we examine them, right? If I say, well, in this case, I'm assuming X. Well, at that moment, I'm not assuming X. I'm examining the assumption that I was using. So, and your assumptions can be, you can be aware of your assumptions. That is, I can say, well, look, I assume the following things about human nature. Right. And then I could list these assumptions. But when they're operating as assumptions, they're being taken for granted. They're not being discussed, they're not being questioned. They're just being assumed. They're assumed to be true. And I'm sort of saying it the same way.
Well, I would say that that's often the case, especially psychologically, but probably the most famous historical case of assumptions are Euclid's axioms. An axiom is an assumption. And the entire system of Euclidean geometry is built on these 5 postulates, another word for assumptions. So those were examined explicitly again and again. And the same is true in a lot of other fields. Newton's laws of motion, the 3 laws of motion, are all assumptions, meaning they're taken for granted or they're believed as true, but they can't be demonstrated. They can't be proven, but everything is founded on them. But they're not unconscious, and they're quite subject to examination. So one of the famous cases in math is that, I don't want to be too technical, but Euclid's 5th postulate is that parallel lines will never meet. And then in the early 1800s, I mean, no one was ever happy with that as a postulate because they thought, well, it sounds true, but why should I believe that it's true? It's an axiom, so you can't prove it. But so in the early 1800s, they found out that if you make the opposite assumption, you still get geometry. In fact, you get a very different kind of geometry. And that other kind of geometry, called Riemannian, is the foundation of relativity theory. So Euclidean theory is founded on an assumption, the fifth postulate, which only holds on Earth. It only holds for kind of relatively small objects. But if you get large objects, parallel lines do in fact meet. So, but my point about assumptions is that a whole field can be founded on assumptions and they can be examined. But I
Yes,
think you're right, psychologically, they mostly occupy unconsciously. They most,
right.
yeah.
So the term unconscious is a little misleading here because by that I mean that the assumptions that we're making, of course, can be, as I said, brought to the conscious level, and then we can have awareness of them when we're, let's say, thinking through a problem. But if we're truly taking them for granted, again, they're the basis upon which we make other inferences, let's say, or make inferences about new situations. And they're so I think that even though they can be at the conscious level, we need to think about how often they are at the unconscious level. And as you say, from the psychological, if you will, perspective, enter those assumptions and to understand them.
Indeed.
So for instance, all of our prejudices and biases are in the realm of assumptions.
Right.
So
yes, but there's a sense, and that's true, but there's also this other aspect that you and I both recognize very strongly, and that is we often use the word assumptions when we're calling them into question. Oh, you're making the following assumption, but assumptions can in fact be true as well as just justified. So it's true that our biases are going to be our unconscious assumptions, but so is the opposite, right? So we don't want to.
yes,
Yeah. So I don't want to stick too strongly to assumptions that are unjustified, unfounded,
of course.
wrong. Yeah.
So another way to say this is that we must, as humans, we must assume many things to be true in order to
Indeed.
function.
Yes. Very good.
I'm assuming that I'm in a safe place right now and I'm not going to be under attack and nobody's going to be harassing me during this meeting.
Yes.
And,
yes.
Right. And I'm assuming that we're going to use a certain format. And I'm assuming that you're going to behave in certain ways and I'm going to behave in certain ways.
Indeed.
And I'm assuming all kinds of things that I would have to really dig to even realize I'm assuming.
Right. That's right.
Connected to those assumptions in this setting, just in this scenario.
Indeed. Yeah. That's a very nice way of putting it. Yes, indeed. Yeah. And probably there are, in such a situation, there's really an unlimited number of assumptions that we're making. And so it wouldn't make sense to say, okay, so write out all your assumptions. You could say, write out all the important assumptions or all those that are directly operating in this context. Even those we're almost certainly going to miss some.
Right. So if we have to assume many things to be true, then it makes sense that within those beliefs that we're taking to be true in order to function, that within that there are going to be problems. It stands to reason that that's not going to be a perfect package of truths.
Right.
And yet the human mind is functioning, acting as if, believing as if all of this assumption base is reasonable, true, and good